Good morning, welcome back. Today is January 29th, and it's cold and wet outside, so here I am in the basement to talk about what happened on this date in history. Well, first of all, it was on this date in 1523 that Ulrich Zwingli delivered the Sermon of Constance. Now, this is to the Zwinglian Reformation, sort of like what Martin Luther's 95 Theses were to the Lutheran Revolution. So to the Lutheran Reformation. So in the Reformation, there are two basic wings to it. One of them is Lutheran, which is the more well-known one, 1517 95 Thesis. Zwingli, on the other hand, is from Switzerland and becomes a pastor in 1519. And rather than go through any of the normal processes, he decides to just preach his way through the Bible. And in the course of preaching his way through the Bible, he realizes that there are some deficiencies and some problems in the way the church is run. And so ultimately he starts causing problems, and he's asked to stand in front of the Zurich City Council, and he delivers the Sermon of Constance. And that again lists out 67 articles that need to be accepted as true, similar to Luther's 95 Theses. So this is the start of the Zwinglian Reformation, which, if you are following, keeping track, the Zwinglian Reformation is kind of where the Presbyterians and ultimately the Baptists came out of that, as opposed to the Lutheran Reformation. It was on this date in 1595 that legend has it that Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet was first performed. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Despises thy name, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A play that is well known for its romanticism and its love story, but it's still really, really problematic when you look at it as an adult and go, wow, that is a weird story. But be that as it may, highly recommend the play if you have a chance to see it, especially a good quality production. It was on this date in 1845 that Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven was first published. Quoth the raven nevermore, once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered, weak and weary, ever faint, something. That was done on this date in 1845. In 1936, the first 5 players were inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. I know this is one of those great baseball trivia questions. They were in order of voting: Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, Honus Wagner, Christy Mathewson, and Walter Johnson. Those were the first 5. And so Ty Cobb was the top vote getter. Babe Ruth was number 2. Finally, a couple of deaths on this day. It was on this date in 1956 that writer Henry Louis Mencken died. Henry Louis Mencken, H.L. Mencken, better known by the name H.L. Mencken, was a writer in Baltimore. And he was a famous wit, a famous kind of sardonic, cynical sort of, along the lines of a Mike Royko, perhaps, for those of us in the Chicago area. I have a couple. This is a biography of him called Disturber of the Peace. And then I have a book of several of his writings just called Mencken. He was best, one of his claims to fame is that in the Scopes trial in 1925, and we all know that it was John Scopes was on trial, it was William Jennings Bryan for the prosecution, Clarence Darrow for the defense. But one of the things that made that trial such a circus was that H.L. Mencken, who was at the height of his power at the time in terms of literary and following and all, was there reporting on it. In 2023 parlance, we would say he was live tweeting the event. He was putting out dispatches, and again, he was just ridiculing William Jennings Bryan throughout the whole thing. But H.L. Mencken died on this date in 1956. And finally, it was on this date in 1963 that 2 roads did finally diverge in the Yellowwood, because it was on this date that Robert Frost died, the poet Robert Frost. This is a book I've had for a very, very long time. I think this is one of the first books I ever got as on my own. When I was buying books on my own, this book that's the poetry of Robert Frost with some of his best known works. 2 roads diverged in the yellow wood, and be one traveler long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. But that was on this day that he died. It's on this day that he died in 1963. Okay, well, today we're going to get back to talking about Acts. We're going to go into Acts 24, 25. I think if I do it right, we have 3 sessions left. We're going to talk about 24 and 25. We're going to talk about chapter 26 next week, and then we're going to talk about 27 and 28, and then we're going to be done with the book of Acts. We're going to be done with Luke and Acts. So looking forward to that. So let's get back to that, talking about Paul before Felix and Festus. Or is it Festus and Felix? Felix, Festus, and Agrippa, and all of that. So let's get back to that. Good morning, welcome back. We're here today to get back onto track, looking at Luke and Acts. Now today, actually, I think, based on the way I figure it, we have 3 sessions left and we'll be done with Acts. Okay, so today I want to cover 24 and 25, and then next week I want to talk about 26, which is Paul's last great defense speech, and then 27 and 28, we're going to get Paul over to Rome, and then the book ends. And then we'll talk about all of that. So I see 3 sessions, this one, 2 more. There might be a third, but I don't know. Depends on how long I talk. So, all right. So today we're going to start in Luke 24. Actually, we're going to start a little bit before that, because remember, we had this situation about Paul returning to Rome. I'm sorry, Paul returning to Jerusalem. And we had that question, is this a good idea or not? Okay. And we don't really know. Again, it's just speculation looking at it. But the fact remains, Paul goes back to Jerusalem, and as soon as he gets there, he is, he meets the elders, and then the elders of the church, they say, go through this process. Paul goes to the temple. He's seen by some Jews from Ephesus. Then they cause a ruckus. And then so the Roman commander and his soldiers have to come and rescue him. And so to kind of figure out what's going on, the Roman commander sort of arranges this face-to-face confrontation between Paul and the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 23. Of course, that doesn't go very well at all. Okay, and as a result of that, Paul is back into protective custody. Let's call it that. Let's call it that he's in protective custody with the Roman commander, and then he finds out, his nephew actually finds out that there's going, and this is at the end of chapter 23, he finds out that there's a plot that 40 Jewish men have taken a vow that they are not going to eat until they've killed Paul. Now, I don't know what happened because they failed, so I don't know whether all 40 of them starved to death. Somehow, I highly doubt it. But be that as it may, Paul just engendered this kind of a reaction wherever he went. Okay, he has just become that divisive a character, that wherever he goes, there are people there who just really want to see him out of the way. Okay, wink, wink, out of the way. So, and so Paul tips off the Roman commander, and then the Roman commander arranges for him to be taken up to Antioch. So at the end of chapter 23, Paul is taken up to Antioch. Okay, now we have to remember this. So Paul is in Antioch now. So he was in Jerusalem, now he's moved to Antioch under the protection of the Roman commander, and he's still under house arrest. Okay, they're in Antioch, or protective custody, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so he goes up there, and notification is given at the end of chapter 23 to the governor of the area, and that is Felix. Okay, the governor's name is a guy named Felix, and then we're going to pick up with talking about Felix as we get into chapter 24. Okay, so here we go, chapter 24, verse 1. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. Okay, now we've met Ananias before. Now this is not the same Ananias of Acts chapter 5 who dies, okay, for lying about, nor is it the same Ananias who is called in Acts chapter 9 to go and pray over Saul. This is a third Ananias, okay? And this is Ananias the high priest. This is the Ananias the high priest that Paul gets into a verbal altercation in Acts chapter 23. Okay, that's if you remember that scene where the high priest says to somebody, slap him, and they slap him, and Paul reacts, and they say to him, what are you doing, saying this to the high priest? And Paul says, oh, I didn't realize it was the high priest. Okay, so it's that high priest. Okay, so now what's happened is Paul has moved under the safety of the Roman commander up to Caesarea. So now, in order to bring their charges and get their way done with Paul, they have to go where he is, and he's in Antioch, okay, which is not a Jewish stronghold. Okay, there is a lot of Jews there, don't get me wrong, but it's not a Jewish stronghold. It's not like Jerusalem, okay? So they go up there, but this time they bring a lawyer. Okay, now this time, this lawyer is somebody who is, in fact, what we would call like a barrister, somebody who argues in court. Okay, something along that line, closer to the idea of what a lawyer is today. Okay, then, again, we talk about teachers of the law. The teachers of the law are the Bible scholars. They're not lawyers. This guy is, in fact, a lawyer. So they've had a chance to get their act together. They've had a chance to figure out how they really want to present this in the best possible way, because they really want to get Paul officially taken care of. Okay, wink, wink, know what I mean? All right, they really want Paul to be officially taken care of, so they bring this lawyer. Okay, so in verse 2, so they come to Felix, the governor. Now, who is Felix? Okay, not a tremendous amount is known about Felix. It's not like he was one of the seminal leaders of the time. We do know that he was a former slave, had worked his way up, rather corrupt. In fact, he lasts about 7 years, 52 to 59 are the generally accepted years. And then he's recalled to Rome for his corruption. Okay, so again, he's so corrupt that he gets to be known in Rome, that he's actually recalled and he's replaced by Festus. And we'll talk about Festus in a minute. Okay, but Felix is the governor, and he knows that he's got a case here to deal with, and so he sets it up. Now in verse 2, it says, when Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. Okay, and he says, this is Tertullus's opening statement. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. Okay. Now, this is what is often referred to in the Latin, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but it's the Capitatio Benevolentiae. Okay. And basically what it is, it's an opening statement that flatters the person being spoken to. Usually it's a ruler. Okay, so there he says, we have enjoyed a long period of peace under you. Okay, we are so thankful that you're our leader. All right, so this is sort of a normal process when you're dealing in this kind of thing. You always start with praising the ruler that you're in front of. But in verse 4, but in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. And then here in verse 5, we have one of my favorite lines in all of the book of Acts. Okay, in Tertullus, the lawyer, on review of the case, and with the discussion of the high priest and the Sanhedrin and all this, here he gets. He's going to bring in his big indictment. Okay, this is it. He's going to start the argument for the prosecution right here. And his opening line. His opening argument is, verse 5, we have found this man to be a troublemaker. Wow, that's powerful. Okay, we have found this man to be a troublemaker. The King James translates it, I think, something like a pest or a pestilent fellow kind of thing. It's just kind of an interesting phrase. In Luke 21, this phrase is used before. Let me go back to Luke 21. Luke 21, beginning in verse, or I think it's only in verse 11. Jesus is talking there, preaching about the end times. It says, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences. Okay, so that pestilences is the same word used here to describe the Apostle Paul by this lawyer Tertullus. Okay, but that's their opening line. Okay, so it says, "We have found this man to be a troublemaker." Now let's pay careful attention to what is said here, because it oftentimes, it isn't that they're. Well, let me back up. I think he's carefully making a point here to appeal to Felix. Okay, he says, "We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple, so we seized him." Okay, several things to point out about this, but one of the things is to look at the language and think back to in Acts 21 when the commander rescues Paul the first time. And he says, "Aren't you the Egyptian who led people into the desert?" And so it's understood, and I think Josephus verifies this, that Felix was part of the Jewish leadership that put down this Egyptian ruler, or this Egyptian who led a revolution, or led a rebellion, I should say. Okay, and the language he uses to describe Paul is trying to link him with this Egyptian. And in essence, he says, Paul, he's saying, Tertullus is saying to Felix, listen, this guy is just like that Egyptian from a few months ago, a few years ago, whenever it was. He's just as bad. He's a ringleader, stirring up, causing riots. Now, these are not true. These facts are not true. Okay? He is a ringleader. I don't know if ringleader is quite the right word, but he is certainly a leader of the Nazarene sect, and the word sect there, it's an interesting phrase, and I think I'll get to it later. I'll get to it later. I'll talk about it a little bit later. This is what they mean by sect. But he says, and he even tried to desecrate the temple. Okay, now again, this is not. It's not true. Okay, there's no evidence. There's no indication that Paul ever did anything like that. He was purifying himself before he went in. No indication that this ever actually happened. And even tried to desecrate the temple, so we seized him. Okay, so by examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him. The other Jews join in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. Now, again, remember, Luke is writing this. Luke knows these aren't true. He knows these things aren't true that they're saying about Paul, and so basically he's just describing and a bunch of people repeating that this isn't true. Okay, so again, it's kind of like today's environment where you've got people. One side is clearly believes something is true, and the other side clearly believes something else is true. And when describing each other, they just go, "Oh, he just kept saying this is true, this is true, this is true." Okay, so again, Luke is reporting this, and he's saying, "Oh, this is what they're doing. They just keep repeating these baseless charges." Now, side note, there is a if you think back to the story in Acts 21 where Paul is actually captured, the way Tertullus describes it is not really that accurate. Okay. He says, by examining what he even tried to desecrate the temple, so we seized him. Okay. Well, did they really seize him? Wasn't it more of a mob action and the Romans tried to rescue him? So it kind of makes it look like the Jewish leadership had a much more proactive role in this rather than simply reacting to the actions of a mob. That's kind of what it sounds. Now, some have looked at this, and if you have an NIV or more modern translation, you'll notice that there is a text note. In fact, you won't have a verse 7. It goes right from verse 6 to verse 8. Okay, so the wording that's in verse 7 is not in a lot of the better manuscripts. Okay, and it says in that particular text, if you look at one of the, it's in the Western manuscript. Some manuscripts include, and I'm just reading the text note, and we would have judged him. So it says in these other manuscripts, and again, if you have a King James or a New King James, it probably says something along this line. and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him, and we would have judged him in accordance with our law, but the commander Lysias came and took him from us with much violence, ordering his accusers to come before you. Okay, so this addition blames the Roman commander Lysias, I think is how I was pronouncing it, blaming Lysias for the violence, when in fact, no, that's just not true. And that's just not in a lot of the original, or any of the original manuscripts, okay, which is one of the reasons why the NIV and the more modern translations just leave it as a text note. Say, okay, but it is, and it just kind of tries to make the Roman leader, the Jewish leader, sound a little bit more proactive than they actually were. But regardless, the Jewish leaders are trying to phrase this in the most positive way they can. When the governor motioned for him to speak, so again, okay, Paul, got anything to say? Paul replied, now again, they're in Antioch. Okay, I don't know if I made that clear. Okay, they're in Antioch. So these Jewish leaders have come up. Now this is like the second or third time that Paul has stood before these guys. And it says, again, Paul starts with a capitatio benevolentiae. I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. Okay, this little praiseworthy statement at the beginning that, oh, you're a great guy, happy to be here. Let me tell you what my defense is, okay? You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Okay, now, Paul is saying, I was only in Jerusalem for 12 days. Okay, now, the 12 days is a little tricky because we don't know what he's counting from and what he's counting to. Okay, so again, depending on how you count it, you can look at it and say, well, Paul was only in Jerusalem for a certain number of days. Other times you look at it and go, wait a minute, he was in there for at least 2.5 weeks. Okay, but again, we don't know what Paul is counting from or to. Okay, the gist of what Paul is saying is like, I've only been in Jerusalem for a short period of time, 12 days at most. Okay, and he just points out, my accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. Okay, which kind of reminds me, and maybe Luke is doing this intentionally, in Luke 21 when they come to Jesus in the garden, and Jesus' reply is, am I leading a rebellion that you come to me with swords, and an army? It's like, wow, and in verse 13, and again, this first paragraph here is kind of like Paul's opening statement, okay? And basically he says, look, I'm glad you're here, glad to have the opportunity. I've only been here for a short period of time. So you look at all of those things that they said about him, it's like, I've only been here for a couple weeks. Okay? Is it reasonable to think that I could have accomplished all that they said in a couple of weeks? But finally, in verse 13, and they cannot prove to you the charges that they are not making against me. They can't prove that I tried to desecrate the temple. Now again, they're in Antioch. Desecrating the Jewish temple is not as big a deal in Antioch as it is in Jerusalem. Okay, it's still a big deal. I'm not trying to minimize it, but again, Felix isn't going to be that, that interested in desecrating the temple. But regardless, it says, and I cannot prove to you. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way. Okay, again, the way is the New Testament description of the Christian belief. This John the Baptist correction of Judaism that leads to Christ. Okay, that grafts in the Gentile believers into the story. That's called the way. So, and to follow the way to Paul is to be a good Jew. Okay, there's nothing incompatible with being a good Jew to Paul and being a follower of the way. Okay, however, I admit to you that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. Okay, now a sect, the word sect, and I talked about it earlier, we kind of think about, when we think about a sect today, we kind of think about a whole nother religion. And that really isn't accurate. It's more, Well, they earlier in, I think it's in, let me see, in Acts chapter 5 and in Acts chapter 15, both times Luke talks about the party of the Philippines, or a party of the Philippines, party of the Pharisees, and the party of the Pharisees, both times, 5 and 15, both times talk about that's the same word that's translated here as sect. Okay, so it's the party. It's like a subgroup. It's kind of the gist of it, and Paul doesn't think he's a subgroup. Okay, Paul doesn't think that he's and I think that actually the literal rendering of the word means choosing. Paul doesn't think that he's chosen a different route. Paul thinks he's right in the mainstream of what Judaism should be. Okay. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. So again, there goes your desecration thing. And I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. Now, if you remember Paul's discussion in Acts 21, when he's in front of the Sanhedrin, that's where he gets in a little hot water because of complaining or lashing out at being stricken, and they say, "How could you do that to the high priest? I didn't know it was the high priest." And then he says, "But I'm here for the resurrection," and that kind of blows up the crowd. Okay, and then the Pharisees in the group are like, "We're not going to condemn him. How do we know that an angel didn't talk to him?" And it kind of ends the discussion. Okay, so Paul here brings up the whole resurrection Pharisee card, for lack of a better word, again. Okay, and I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. So the gist here is that Paul is saying there is no way, based on my lifestyle and my history, that I would have ever done anything in violation of the Jewish law, which is essentially what, or that would have caused me to be labeled a troublemaker. But he continues, verse 17, after an absence of several years. Okay, now this is talking back when we first got Paul back to Jerusalem. He said it had been several years. But here, I think he makes this point to say, I've only been here in Jerusalem for a few days, a short period of time, and I was gone for several years before that. So is it reasonable to assume that I was able to accomplish all these terrible things that these guys are saying when I'd been gone for many years and I've only been back for a couple of weeks? I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremoniously clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. Okay, their charges that you were desecrating the temple. Paul's like, no, I was ceremonially clean. Remember, he had shaved his head, he had taken the vow, he had gone with these 4 guys. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. Okay, again, none of this stuff that you say, I'm not a ringleader, I'm not causing riots, I was by myself when you got me. But, verse 19, there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here. Now, these are these Jewish leaders or Jewish believers from Ephesus who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. So I think Paul's point here is like, look, if there's somebody that has anything against me, it's these guys from Ephesus. They're the ones that have been trolling me, not these guys. Okay? In other words, looking at it from a jurisprudence point of view, Paul is helping them out. He's going, hey, you got the wrong witnesses here, okay? If you really want to bring a case, go get the guys from Ephesus. These guys got nothing. Go get the guys from Ephesus. Or, if you can't find those, verse 20, or those who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Unless, verse 21, it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence, and this is going back to Acts 21, we mentioned it earlier. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on the trial before you today. Okay. Now, if you remember in Acts 21, this kind of stops the trial in its tracks, and as a matter of fact, it does the same thing here. So again, when Paul goes in 1 Corinthians and talks about the resurrection being a stumbling block, the scandal on. You can just go back to Acts and see that every time Paul brings the resurrection up, it has a tendency to blow up the conversation or stop the conversation, and that's exactly what happens here in verse 22. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. Now, this is the first time we hear that Felix knows anything about the way. Okay, again, the way is that Jewish belief that Jesus is the Messiah, the gospel. Okay, how is it that Felix is well acquainted with the way? We don't know. It doesn't say. It just asserts Felix. Maybe he's an attentive ruler. Maybe he just knows what's happening in his community. Okay, but once Paul lays down the resurrection thing, it says, then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, again, this is the guy who rescued Paul and sends the letter, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guards, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. So again, Paul is under some sort of a loose arrest in Antioch. Okay? He's not in a cell, he's not in the stocks, but he's not free to go. So he's at his house. Is it a house arrest? Is it protective custody? Not quite sure. But regardless, Paul is there, and he says, all right, I'm going to keep you here till I can, when this Lysias guy comes, then we'll talk about this again. But in the meantime, go here. He ordered Paul keep under guard, but to give him some freedom. Okay. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla. Okay, now Felix is married to Drusilla. Now this is kind of an interesting thing. Drusilla is the daughter of Herod Agrippa. Okay, Herod Agrippa is the Herod of earlier in Acts that killed James. Herod Agrippa is the son of Herod the Great in Matthew 2, who killed the, do you know where the Messiah is and all of that. Okay, so Drusilla, Felix's wife, is the granddaughter of Herod the Great. Okay, we're not done with this whole family tree thing yet, but keep that in mind. All right, so Felix comes with his wife, who is Jewish. So how does Felix know about the way? Is it through Drusilla? Perhaps. Okay, now there's no indication that Felix himself is Jewish, or maybe he just went to work there in Jerusalem and found a Jewish woman he liked. Could be, probably wasn't, but that's kind of that's a possibility. So they come in. So he sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about his faith in Christ Jesus. So now Felix comes in and says, all right, I'm going to listen to this guy with my wife, not with these high priest guys here. Let's just kind of listen to him talk about his faith in Christ. Okay. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. Okay, so I don't know. Is it something? Is Drusilla doing the same as Pilate's wife? Don't have anything to do with them or any? I don't know. Just an idea. But again, Felix is like, okay, I don't want to deal with you right now. His wife is there. He doesn't want to make a decision. He says, I'll call you later. Okay. And then Luke adds, at the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. Okay. Now, on the one hand, this isn't that uncommon. The idea that the ruler is waiting for some sort of a bribe, especially when he's dealing with somebody who he knows really is innocent, that he knows he really doesn't need to deal with this issue. Okay, just throw some money my way. Which gets back to, why doesn't Paul just do that? Well, you can say, well, bribing is wrong, and that would be perfectly correct to say that. Okay, but wouldn't this have been a good way for him to get to Rome? I don't know. Okay, and really, you start asking, how does Luke know this? I mean, is Felix coming out afterwards? Man, I wish he'd offered me a bribe. Does he see Paul in the hallway and does he say, hey, or does he see Luke in the hallway and say, hey,
tell your guy to throw a couple of ducats my way and I'll let him go. Okay? Maybe he does. And Paul refuses because, again, going back to our discussion of Paul's getting to Rome, Paul recognizes that once he's out of Roman custody, somebody is going to lay wait for him and kill him. So Paul needs to stay. Paul believes, I think, this is my opinion, that Paul believes he needs to stay in Roman custody in order to get to Rome. That he's not going to get to Rome safely on his own. So there's no way Paul is going to give him a bribe. Maybe he was explicit. Maybe he said, look, you know what, if you just throw a few, some change my way, I'll make sure you get out of here. And Paul's like, no, my goal is to get to Rome. Okay? We don't really know. Okay? We just take Paul, basically the inspiration that it's accurate. How Luke knows this, I don't know. He was hoping, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. So maybe he was just somebody you like to talk to, like to listen to. Maybe Paul was an interesting guy. But the sad point is, and to me this is kind of sad, and this is one of the things that makes me think it wasn't the greatest idea for Paul to go to Rome this way. It says in verse 27, when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. So we find out that Felix, not only being corrupt, is kind of a coward. I mean, he knows Paul is innocent. But he wants to do a favor for the Jews. He doesn't, and I think it isn't that he's trying to curry their favors as much as he's trying to avoid their disfavor. Okay, is there a whole lot of difference between the two? I don't think so. All right, but he leaves him in prison for 2 years. So Paul is under this house arrest for 2 years. Now, some have argued and suggested this was a great time for Paul to deal with some of his writings, and that could very well be true. Okay, and we don't know because there's no date stamp on when the various books were written, but it could very well be true. It could be true that given Paul's stature, that he was in a situation where all he needed to do was just be in a place and people could come see him and be counseled and trained and taught and things like that. So, but Felix wanted to grant a favor, so he left Paul in prison, and Felix is replaced by a guy named Festus. Okay, Festus. Chapter 25, beginning with verse 1. 3 days after arriving in the province, that is Antioch, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Okay, so keep in mind, Festus is going from Antioch to Jerusalem. Paul is still in Jerusalem. Okay, so Festus, the new governor, comes into town, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. Paul is not in the room. So the Jewish leaders recognize that for whatever reason, we don't know, Felix isn't going to pull the trigger on Paul. Now we got this new guy. Let's waylay him with the facts about Paul. They requested Festus as a favor to them. Okay, because again, Festus, his job is to make sure this place stays under control. And, wow, we would take it really nicely if you would let us deal with this guy. They requested Festus as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. It's like, you know what? Can you send that Paul guy back down here? Because we really want to talk to him. We just want to have a conversation. It's going to be good. We just want to have a conversation. Okay? Festus, bless his heart, answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea. He's talked with Felix about this. He knows these guys are not right in the head. Okay? And I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. Festus is like, no, let's not do it that way. I'm going to go back to Antioch. If you guys want to come on. And again, in parentheses, it's like, just like you did 2 years ago with my predecessor, Felix. Okay? After spending 8 or 10 days with them, verse 6, Festus went down to Caesarea. Okay, again, you always go down from Jerusalem. The next day he convened the court in order that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. So again, we're replaying this same scene from 2 years prior. And apparently, some Jews had followed him from Jerusalem to make this case, or there was a group of Jews in Antioch that were ready at a moment's notice to do this. Okay? We don't know which it is, but regardless, here's Paul again in front of a different ruler, probably the same room, possibly the same Jewish leaders, going over the same things. They brought many serious. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Now, the irony here is that they had 2 years to build up their case. They had 2 years to develop evidence. Okay. Now, again, this is Luke's opinion, and Paul is not being convicted, but he's not being set free either. Okay. Then Paul made his defense, and this is like Paul's shortest defense. Okay. He says, I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, because again, he's in charge of Israel, the Levant. Okay, so he wants to keep these guys assuaged. So he comes up with this idea. He says, hey, wait a minute. What if, verse 9, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? So remember, Paul was in Jerusalem, 40 people, taken Antioch, stays in Antioch 2 years. Festus's idea is like, look, if you go back to Jerusalem, things will work out. Okay? Now, Paul is not buying that. Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. Again, he's a Jew, he's a Roman citizen. Right? He's like, I'm not going to go back to that kangaroo court. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. Okay? Again, he's been there for 2 years. He's talked to Felix until he's blue in the face. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. Okay? And so it's like, it's been proven over and over again that these are not true. And I'm not going to be handed over to them. And so finally, this is where Paul hits on his thing. He says, I appeal to Caesar. Okay, so apparently within the Jewish or within the Roman judicial system, a plaintiff or defendant, depending on how you look at it, could at any time appeal to being heard in front of an official Roman court in Rome. And that would supersede any court, any local court that he was in. And Paul realizes, I have been here for 2 years, and after 2 years of being here talking to Felix, the new guy's great idea is to send me back to Jerusalem. He's like, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. I appeal to Caesar. Okay? After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go. All right. You win. You're going to go to Caesar. Verse 13. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Felix. Okay. Now, this is King Agrippa II. Okay. This is the son of Herod Agrippa. This is the brother of Drusilla, who was Felix's wife. Okay, he's with a woman named Bernice. Now, Bernice is his sister. Now, the text here does not say that they are our husband and wife. Okay, it makes sense that that being Herod Agrippa, being the king, that he would want to make travel, and if his sister was one of his advisors, then certainly it would make sense that she would travel with him. So people don't really know, is this a business relationship, or are they in some sort of an incestuous kind of relationship? We don't really know. But Bernice is Drusilla's sister. So Drusilla, Bernice, and Herod Agrippa II are all brother and sister. They're all siblings, or they're all children of Herod Agrippa. Okay, the king who killed James and put Peter in prison in Acts chapter 10 through 15, somewhere in the middle of Acts. Okay? And they're all grandchildren of Herod the Great. Okay? So King Agrippa, and now King Agrippa, I believe, would have outranked Festus. Okay, so basically it's like the governor comes to town and visits with the mayor. Okay, the mayor's an important dude. It's the mayor's call, but if the governor's there, hey, let me ask you about this, in the U.S. Okay. So a few days later came to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, and this is just sort of factual, so there's not a lot to analyze here. There is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the law brought charges against him and they asked that he be condemned. Kind of remind you, that guy that's been in your prison for 2 years? Verse 16, I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers, certainly not a Roman citizen, and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Okay? Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. Okay, it's interesting. If we go back to Acts 18:14, Paul is in Corinth here. All right, let me finish this point here. Verse 20, I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. So this discussion that Festus has with Herod Agrippa, he says, I expected some serious charges, but all I got were this stuff about their Jewish religion, which sounds very much like in Acts chapter 18, when they go to Corinth and they talk in front of Gallio. Remember, Paul's about to speak, and Gallio's like, no. This isn't anything. This isn't my jurisdiction. You guys want to argue about this, go ahead, but don't do it on my time. Okay? And so Festus is sounding a lot like that. It's like, this isn't anything. But he says, I was at a loss, so I asked if he would be willing, but when Paul made his appeal, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. He replied, tomorrow you will hear him. The next day, verse 23, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem. Okay, the whole Jewish community? Okay, maybe it's like some of them have petitioned for his freedom, some of them have petitioned for his death. Okay, and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, a la Gallio. But because he had made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. It's like, what do I tell him? This is this inner Jewish thing, and they're pulling legal tricks. I don't know what to do with this guy. I decided to send him, but I have nothing definite. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. So it's like, Festus is saying, King, listen, I don't know what to write about this guy. Let him tell you his spiel, and then you tell me what I should write to Rome, and we'll be good. Okay? For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. So really, Festus knows that there's nothing under Roman law that would convict Paul. Now, Jewish law is a different thing, but Festus knows that there's nothing under Roman law that would convict him. Okay, so next week we'll talk about chapter 26, and that's where Paul makes his defense before Agrippa. Okay, Agrippa and Berenice, and Festus for that matter. Okay, Paul's last great defense speech in the book of Acts is in Acts chapter 26, and we'll finish with that next week. Okay, so again, thank you very much for being with me. If you have any questions, by all means, let me know. Send me an email, fax, text, carrier pigeon, raven, however you want to do it. I'll be more than happy to work on an answer for you. All right, thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you next week.